Between marketing the Great Depression and World War II, animal fats were down for the count. Procter and Gamble, seeing an opportunity to propel their beloved invention even further into the spotlight, decided they would pay the American Heart Association $1.75 million for an endorsement proclaiming that Crisco was healthier than animal fats. The American Heart Association accepted, and with that, the demise of animal fats in the American diet was inevitable. The problem with this endorsement by the AHA was that there was no proof of its claim at the time, not a single study demonstrating that natural animal fats pose any harm at all. But animal fats were demonized anyway and booted out of our diets around the world. From cakes and cookies to fried foods, the world's demand for Crisco was explosive. Soon, every family had a tub of Crisco in their pantry. Restaurants across the nation used it, and it could be found in nearly all processed and prepackaged foods. With heart disease rates increasing, the world needed something to blame. During a 1956 nationwide television broadcast sponsored by the American Heart Association, viewers were encouraged to adopt the prudent diet, named for its proposed ability to reduce heart disease risk. The prudent diet consisted of a torturous regime of cold cereal, corn oil, margarine, and chicken in place of butter, lard, beef, and eggs, much to the likely dismay of the American Heart Association and producer and Procter and Gamble. Dr. Dudley White, a participant in the televised show and the personal physician of President Eisenhower, said, "I began my practice as a cardiologist in 1921, and I never saw a heart attack patient until 1928. Back in the heart attack free days before 1920, the fats were butter and lard, and I think that we would all benefit from that kind of diet that we had at a time when no one had even heard the word corn oil." But Dr. White later reversed his opinion. President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack, and his doctor sent him home with a prescription for anticoagulant drugs and recommendations to consume a low-fat diet. Dr. White's change of stance, despite the complete lack of evidence linking saturated fat and heart disease, could likely be attributed to its time spent with Ancel Keys, with whom he traveled internationally. Eisenhower, who ranked rare steak as one of his favorite foods, made it a personal mission to eliminate animal fats and cholesterol from his diet. The American public watched their beloved president's treatment closely, and interest groups didn't waste a minute in broadcasting the fact that Eisenhower was fighting heart disease with partially hydrogenated fats. He died of heart disease 14 years later. In 1957, a year after the introduction of the prudent diet, a researcher by the name of George Christakis decided to put it to the test in a group of men aged 40 to 59. The results of the study showed that the men who followed the prudent diet had a lower cholesterol level of 220 milligrams per deciliter compared to 250 milligrams per deciliter of the men who ate animal fats. Christakis was pleased and concluded his study appears to have established a reasonable basis for public health action. That might have been true except for this buried gem of a statement about the study from a published paper in 1966. 8 deaths from heart disease among prudent dieter group, none among controls, eating eggs every day and meat at every meal. Around the same time, Eisenhower suffered a heart attack. Ancel Keys was commissioned by the U.S. Public Health Service to investigate the effects of dietary fat. Much like ravenous wolves stalking their prey, the partially hydrogenated fat industry watched closely, eagerly awaiting the perfect opportunity to strike. As we discussed in Chapter 1, the 7-country study performed by Ansel Keys was highly flawed and not at all conclusive, but a study that could link heart disease to animal fat consumption was a huge financial gain for the vegetable oil industry. Like dominoes, the AHA, the government, and various other health organizations and authorities all fell in line, proclaiming low-fat diets were healthier and safer. Meanwhile, the heart disease rate was steadily increasing with no end in sight. At this point, it was too late. Critics were silenced, and researchers who spoke out against Key's crude studies were mocked and had their jobs threatened. One lone naysayer. In the last chapter, we talked about landmark studies like the 7-country study, the Framingham study, the Nurses' Health study, the Finnish Mental Hospital study, and more, all of which were flawed in numerous ways. But who was looking at trans fat? After all, organizations like the AHA were touting it as healthier than butter. Where did that claim come true? Where did that claim come from? The truth is, there was little to no science on how trans fat affected the human body, not until 1957. For the 46 years since Crisco first appeared on the market, there was not a single human clinical study on trans fats. Yet the partially hydrogenated fat industry claimed their product was healthier, safer, and better. If there was no research supporting this claim, does that mean the entire trans fat industry was built on nothing but a fat-fetched lie? We'll leave that for you to decide. There is one very important study that occurred in parallel to Key's research. Before the official gavel came down on animal fats, it was by a biochemist who would later become instrumental in the downfall of trans fat. His name was Fred Kumerow. At the time, Kumerow was a researcher at the University of Illinois. He managed to acquire autopsy samples from individuals who had died of heart disease. What he discovered was nothing short of astonishing. After examining the samples, he was able to locate artificial trans fat lining the tissue of human hearts. Kumerow published his findings in Science, one of the most prestigious academic journals. It was the first published human clinical study on trans fat. You would think that Kumerow's study would have sparked an important discussion and a desire for further research on trans fat. Instead, his findings were met with contempt and he was shunned. But Kumerow was determined to further explore the effects of trans fat regardless of those who opposed his work. This marked the beginning of his 56-year crusade against trans fats. Kumerow, who started his day with fried eggs and a glass of milk, was hard at work trying to find a way to convince the world that trans fat wasn't all it was made up to be. By 1968, Kumerow noticed that heart disease death rate went up every passing decade, but it was an uphill battle against regarding authorities championing the use of partially hydrogenated fats over animal fats. Despite this, his research continued through the mid-1970s when he investigated the effects of dietary trans fats on pigs. The pigs who were fed artificial trans fat had deadly levels of plaque in their arteries. Kumerow brought his findings to the FTC, who shockingly rejected him because he was a biochemist and not a cardiologist. Then in 1976, much to Kumerow's dismay, the FDA officially determined there was no evidence suggesting trans fat was dangerous. Worse, Kumerow's efforts to get trans fat banned did not go unnoticed. Ansel Keys' opinion held great sway with the AHA, the National Institute of Health, and various government policy makers. Keys' powers and influence over decision makers may have been the cause of certain researchers losing their funding. Keys did not take kindly to those whose opinion differed from his own. Instead of scientific debate, he resorted to name-calling and public shaming. Among the researchers who lost funding from the NIH was Kumro, with no other option but to pay his staff out of his own pocket. Kumro pressed on in his fight against trans fats. The tables began to turn. By the 1990s, there was a growing body of evidence that trans fat was dangerous. To defend their product and prove the opposition wrong, the partially hydrogenated fat industry spent $1 million funding a study of their own. The results were nothing short of embarrassing. The industry study, published on October 4, 2001, showed that trans fat actually increased the risk of heart disease more than saturated fat. With the overwhelming amount of evidence against trans fat and the industry's self-incrimination through their own funded study, it would seem trans fat was at its end of days, and yet the FDA did not make a move until 2003. And instead of outright banning trans fats like Denmark, the FDA chose to enforce labeling requirements beginning in 2006. In short, manufacturers were required to list trans fat content on the nutritional labels of their food. To make matters worse, companies did not have to list trans fat content if it was less than half a gram per serving. This was problematic in two ways. One, most people do not understand how to read nutritional labels. Two, it was still very easy to consume dangerous amounts of trans fat. Initially, the FDA did not propose to add a statement to foods containing trans fat that recommended trans fat intake should be as low as possible. However, that was later retracted as FDA stated they received a very negative comments about it. It is interesting to note that they were more concerned about the trans fat industry's reaction than the heart disease risk of Americans. The downfall of trans fat. As research linking trans fat to heart disease grew even more conclusive, Fred Kumro decided to submit a 1,000-word petition to the FDA in 2009, demanding they ban trans fat. The FDA never responded, despite the strong evidence clearly proving their harm. Finally, in 2013, Kumro sued the FDA, prompting them to immediately issue a press release announcing a ban on trans fat in the food supply. They did not ban it outright, however, and companies were given a 5-year grace period to remove trans fat from foods. An important lesson. Why did the FDA choose to drag their feet in banning trans fat? If they removed it from the American diet immediately, as many other countries chose to do, more lives could have been saved. In fact, experts believe that trans fat is responsible for up to 100,000 deaths per year. If this estimate is correct, the FDA's delay may have resulted in the deaths of millions of Americans, a number that rivals the American soldiers who died in all wars since 1775 combined. And that's just in the last 2 decades. How many have lost their lives since 1911, when partially hydrogenated fat was introduced to the market? The death toll could very well add up to one of the greatest disasters in our history. Yet the trans fat industry and our government are quietly brushing trans fat under the carpet, with many Americans completely unaware of the devastation it caused during its 107-year reign. If it's a lesson that we should all take note of. Be careful when you tamper with the food given to us by nature. Summary. Artificial or industrial trans fat was created in 1901 to stabilize and solidify vegetable oils, but it had an unforeseen effect: the creation of unnatural fatty acids that your body simply doesn't recognize and that stay in your body, coating your cells for a very long time. The trans fat industry, originating with Crisco and continuing with margarine, convinced the American Heart Association, the National Institutes of Health, and other health organizations that despite no evidence in the beginning or later deeply flawed evidence from Ansel Keys that trans fat were healthier and animal fats were bad for you. With savvy marketing and the onset of the Great Depression and World War II, trans fat rapidly became the primary fat consumption in America. One man, Fred Kummerow, stood against the trans fat industry as he proved time and again that trans fats were causing heart disease. It took until 2003 for the FDA to ban trans fats, likely resulting in the deaths of millions of people. Chapter 3: Omega-3 and Omega-6. What's evolution got to do with it? Back in Chapter 1, we dropped some hints that the abundance of omega-6 fats and the scarcity of omega-3s in the modern food supply are major contributors to the tsunami of chronic disease crashing down on us. If we currently consume too much omega-6 and too little omega-3, how much should we be getting and why? And how did things get so out of balance? The story of omega-3 and omega-6 is nothing less than the story of us, of humans, the diet we evolved on, and its implications for the way we eat now. It took the entire history of the world to reach a global population of 1 billion humans by 1850. It took only 80 more years for our numbers to double to 2 billion in 1930. After that, it was less than 50 years until we doubled again to 4 billion people in 1976. And a mere 10 years beyond that, when we tipped the population scales to 5 billion in 1986. If there's one thing we humans like to do, it's reproduce. This exponential rise in the human population meant that there was, and still is, a demand for food to be produced ever more quickly and inexpensively in order to feed us. The need for cheaper and faster food was part of what led to the growth and expansion of agriculture and eventually to the Industrial Revolution. As we transitioned from our hunter-gatherer origins to settling in locations for the longer term and planting crops, literally and figuratively putting down roots, we began to rely more on grains as a source of calories. With the advent of industrialization and the mechanization of food production, factories rather than farms became the source for our food. The quality of food was sacrificed in favor of quantity and ease of sale, production, and distribution. We have more calories available to us today than ever before, but fewer nutrients. We are, as they say, overfed but undernourished. The three most dramatic changes that occurred with fats in our diet over the past 100 years are: number one, an increase in omega-6, mainly from linoleic acid in industrial seed oils such as cottonseed, soybean, corn, safflower, and sunflower oils. Number two, an increase in industrial trans fats. Number three, a decrease in omega-3 fats, both the type that comes mainly from plants, ALA, and the types that come from animals, EPA and DHA. These changes paralleled the dramatic rise in chronic disease in the United States during the same time period, which is a hint that they are likely culprits. They're not the only guilty parties, but their fingerprints are all over the scene of the crime. Another important change to our food supply was that we went from eating wild plants to domesticated ones, which are typically grown in enormous monocropping systems, meaning one plant grown in large quantities with nothing else grown in the same field. Wheat, corn, and soybeans are typically grown this way in the U.S. now, but it wasn't always so. Perhaps even more important than the change in our cultivation of plants was the change in how we raise animals for food. After evolving for millions of years on wild game and seafood, most meat sold in grocery stores now come from concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFO, and increasingly seafood from aquatic farms, which are basically feedlots for fish. Most animals raised for meat, especially beef and pork, start their lives on small farms or ranches, where they eat their natural diet of grass, cattle, or non-omnivorous diet, pigs. But when they reach a certain age or size, they're sent to feedlots where they're fed GMO grains and soybeans loaded with herbicides in order to fatten them up quickly for market. These two changes led to significant differences in the nutritional content of the plants and animal foods we now consume. Modern day plants are lower in omega 3 than wild vegetations was even a few generations ago, and domesticated animals contain more omega 6 and less omega 3 than wild animals, and less omega 3 than animals that are grass fed or allowed to forage on pasture. The biggest of these changes happened in just the last 100 years. In evolutionary terms, that is barely the blink of an eye. It isn't even enough time for humans to have evolved genetic adaptations to do well on this newfangled diet. Well, maybe a few odd bulls among us have. We all have that one friend or relative who prefers highly processed junk food, never exercises, stays up half the night, and does all the other wrong things but appears to be outwardly healthy, look fit, and could grace the cover of magazines. Unfortunately, those rare individuals are the exceptions, not the rule. You are still carrying your prehistoric Paleolithic genes, and these genes are not merely a terrible match for a modern food supply. They are a prescription for absolute disaster. Your poor DNA has no idea what to do with industrially processed chicken nuggets and baseball game nachos swimming in cheese sauce. This being the case, if you're looking to restore your health and stay healthy into a robust old age, a good place to start would be to return to a way of eating more closely aligned with what your ancient genes are expecting. So, what exactly is that? Omega 3s in the seas. From as far back as 3.5 billion years ago until around 500 million years ago, the main form of life on Earth was blue-green algae. There wasn't much oxygen in the atmosphere, so there were few to no organisms that breathed in the way we think of breathing today. However, these algae produce oxygen via photosynthesis. So over time, the concentration of oxygen on Earth increased until eventually it reached a point where new life forms were able to develop. These new life forms consumed the blue-green algae, including the omega-3s contained within them, and these omega-3s became concentrated in the cell membranes of the new life forms. This is the ancient origin of seafood being high in two particular omega-3 fats, EPA and DHA. Marine life forms also contain some of the omega-6 linoleic acid, La, but only very small amounts. Squid, herring, shellfish, and plankton contain as much as 300 times more EPA and DHA than La, making seafood more richer in omega-3 than omega-6. So omega-3 fats are extremely prevalent in foods from the ocean. But humans live on land, many living some thousands of miles from an ocean. While populations that lived in coastal areas or on islands would have had early access to seafood and may have made it a key part of their diet, what about those who lived far than inland? How did humans not living near the sea obtain these special omega-3 fats? Early humans and the brain. The way early humans got EPA and DHA when they weren't in their foods that they made them inside themselves. This biochemical factory within them allowed them to expand into areas of the world where marine foods were scarce. Since they could synthesize these fats internally, they didn't have to stay in places where seafood was abundant. And this neat biological party trick is still with us today, imprinted in our DNA. Since you can't make something out of nothing, the EPA and DHA we create inside us have to come from somewhere. They come from the omega-3 fat alpha-linoleic acid, ALA. All humans have the ability to convert ALA to EPA and DHA, but some of us do it better than others. There's no skill or talent involved, so it's not something you can learn to do better. It's genetic. Brian Peskin advocates for parent essential oils, ALA and LA, from plants rather than long-chain omega-3s from fish, because most humans don't convert ALA to EPA and DHA very well. He argues that long-chain fats must not be that important for us and perhaps might even be harmful since humans are unable to synthesize them in large quantities. But the process by which we make EPA and DHA from ALA takes a lot of energy. So during times when our food supply of EPA and DHA was abundant, a limited ability to make this conversion would have been beneficial. We wouldn't have wasted precious biochemical energy in a process that was unnecessary. But when food sources of preformed EPA DHA were not readily available, it would have been advantageous to have an increased ability to convert ALA to EPA and DHA, like an emergency protection mode, something to be called upon when absolutely needed. All this suggests that even if, or more likely because, some of us have a low ability to convert ALA to EPA and DHA, these special omega-3 fats are important for us. And considering that a genetic change resulting in a better capacity to convert ALA to EPA and DHA was one of the factors that enabled early humans to expand throughout Africa, it's safe to say that EPA and DHA aren't harmful. Even so, like water and like oxygen, it's possible to get too much of a good thing. So just how much EPA and DHA were included in early man's typical menu?